All right, let's get started.
All right, sounds good. Welcome, everybody. Let me quickly get PowerPoint rolling here, and we will get this party started. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Really excited to see the Exchange Airlift Exchange Conference coming back. So I wore my 2012 conference shirt to help set the right vibe. Uh, Also to announce that I'm old, in case there was any doubt about that. But what I'm going to talk about today is a scoring tool that most of you have probably heard of, but that you may not be deeply familiar with, the compliance score and secure score functionality. And the point that I want to leave you with when you walk out of here today is that these tools are really valuable to help you quickly snap in on some high value things you can do to better protect your environment. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction, move into talking about how the scoring mechanisms work, what they tell you and what they don't tell you, and then give you some hopefully useful guidance on how you can improve your scores. Now, sadly, this is not like a tips and tricks session. I'm not going to tell you, oh, if you want to boost your score the most, go find this one setting, right? This is not a one weird trick kind of presentation. But instead, I want you to get a good understanding of kind of the holistic whole of what these scoring tools can do for you and how you can use them. Because they're very much an ongoing, not just a one time do it once and forget about it thing. Okay, hopefully that's better and you actually can see my slide. I got a little over my skis there and got started before I verified that everybody could see. So who am I? I've been an Office Apps and Services MVP since 2003. Before Office Apps and Services was a thing, I was an Exchange MVP. And I've been working in and around Microsoft security documentation and security feature set since, for those of you who remember, before the 10 immutable laws that Scott Culp published back in the day, before trustworthy computing even. So I've been around this for a while, and I have to say that the secure score and compliance score tool sets are one of the most useful security tools that are out there because I'll tell you why in a little while, but the fact that they're available to everybody is a pretty significant innovation in a lot of ways. In my day job, I'm the senior director of product management for Keep It. So I make backup software for Microsoft 365, Azure Active Directory, Google Workspace, Salesforce, Dynamics, and so on. You will probably see my cat. Some of you who have been to my other presentations are used to having him jump on the table. I don't actually know where he is right now, so he could appear at any moment. And if I'm honest right now, the weather outside is absolutely stunning, and I'd rather be flying around than talking, but this is a pretty good second by comparison. And I'll make allowances for the fact that this is the first time we've had MEC in quite some time. So why are we here? What's this presentation about? Well, when you leave, what I'm hoping is that you're going to be able to have a good understanding of what these scoring mechanisms are, what they're for, how they work, what they do and don't do. Okay, and this is really important. Security scores, compliance scores, any kind of numerical metric is a help in your security deployment. It's not a panacea. And if you only pay attention to the number itself, you're going to miss out on some things that are important. I'm going to talk about why that is, but I want you to understand that the score is a kind of the first derivative or the first metric that you can use to tell you if things are going in the right direction. But the score by itself is not the only thing you need to think about. I'm going to talk about how to get the most value out of the security changes that you can make using these tools, and then hopefully prepare you when you leave this session to be ready to use these tools operationally to improve your Microsoft 365 security. So anytime we talk about scoring systems, right, we all love the idea of having a single easy metric that tells us something useful. Okay, this is the whole appeal behind almost every dashboard, almost every KPI or key performance indicator is that, hey, if I can take something complicated and I can squeeze it down to one number or a small set of numbers, then that'll be easier and I don't have to really understand as much. Think about the health score in a restaurant. When you go to a restaurant and you see the sign up on the wall that says this restaurant got a health grade of an A or a health grade of a 94. You can look at that and go, okay, yeah, 94, man, that's way better than 92. You don't really know what makes up that number. But the point of the number is not to give you a detailed low-level view. It's to give you a really high-level, off-the-top, hey, if that number is below 80, I don't want to eat there. And the health department should probably get involved. So scores give you a really easy to understand, easy to communicate way to look at things and rank them or compare them across organizations, across environments. Um, and in the case of secure score and compliance score, across verticals. So one of the things you'll see in a little while is that you can look at how your organization scores against other similar organizations to help you in the process of benchmarking where you stand. The last thing that I want to mention is that scoring gives you a degree of gamification. Now, people are going to be writing papers about the sociology and psychology of gamifying work-related things for decades. There are some cases where I think gamification really makes a lot of sense and can be a very powerful tool. And this is one of them. Okay. Taking a complicated set of measurements of a complicated security environment and refining it down to a small number of scores where you can look at the score and go, hey, the number went up. That's good. That's a great positive use of gamification. But I would be remiss in not saying that scoring systems in general also have some downsides. One is that not every synthetic metric that you can make up as a score makes sense. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to pick a little bit on what used to be the productivity score tool set that Microsoft had, has now been refined to adoption score. They used to give you a score based on how often people used video in meetings. Now, on the face of it, that sounds reasonable, right? Humans are more engaged or more prone to be engaged when they can see each other as part of a meeting or as part of communications. So right now, those of you who are looking at the screen can see my facial expression. You can see when I have hand gestures. You can see, does Paul look bored? Does he look sleepy? Does he look engaged? Does he look excited? Where's the cat? Etc. So it seems like intuitively obvious that having cameras on will lead to more productive meetings, whatever that means. But the problem with the score is, let's say that I go from having 20% of my meetings with cameras on to 40%. What does that mean? Does it mean my, on average, my meeting productivity doubled? Well, no, it probably doesn't, right? So it's possible for you to pick a number or to measure something and make a number out of it when the number didn't actually give you any insight into the thing that you're supposedly measuring. Another problem with scoring systems in general is that the way that you weight the metrics has a huge influence on um, whether the scores tell you anything useful. For those of you who got a chance to go to Greg Taylor's presentation earlier, where he was talking about turning off basic authentication, you can imagine that, if Greg were king for a day, he might come up with a scoring system that would give you 1 million points if you turned off basic authentication and negative 1 million points if you had it on. Okay. That one score in isolation wouldn't tell you anything useful. And you might look at it and go, man, the fastest way for me to get 1 million points is to go tick that box and turn basic authentication off. But that might ignore other things that were actually bigger risk factors or bigger areas of potential improvement that didn't weigh as much, right? People will always try to do what you give them incentives to do. And the bigger the incentive, the stronger the positive pressure or negative pressure around that objective or that incentive. So if you say, I'm going to give this scoring metric a very high weight, well, people are going to game and try to focus on moving that number. And that may not produce the best possible result. I mentioned earlier that gamification has a lot of positive uses. It can be used negatively too, right? Um, you will often see news reports where customer service employees get scored in some way for how long they stay on the phone, or doctors get scored for, are they hitting an average amount of time per patient visit? Sometimes when you put a number on something, that puts pressure on meeting the number and not necessarily on delivering the desired result. Scoring systems, and I got to say this, also have a vulnerability over time. Or maybe vulnerability is not the right word. They have a potential problem over time, which is that when there are new items added to a scoring formula, it gets difficult to compare things fairly. You could, for example, for those of you who are baseball fans, say, well, if I have a time when I'm looking at statistics for a time when, closers were allowed to come in and pitch 1 or 2 innings to finish out the game and a time when they weren't, how can I really tell who the best pitcher of all time is? I have two different bases of measurement. Now, this is a double-edged sword when you look specifically at secure score and compliance score, because on the one hand, yay, Microsoft is continually adding new improvement actions or new things that can give you points. So the good news is the total number of points that you might be able to score in your environment will change over time, and it'll usually go up. The downside to that is it makes it harder to compare. If you snapshot your secure score today and you're at 60%, let's say, and then next month, the secure score team dumps 50 new improvement items that raise the potential score, and now your percentage of the total is lower because you don't have controls in place to get those extra points. You might look at it and go, wait a minute, my secure score went from 60 down to 42. What happened? I didn't change anything. That's bad. And so I mention that because I want you to be aware, on balance, it's very good that Microsoft is introducing new items for you to take action to improve your overall security driven by these scores. But you can't just look at the number in isolation over time without considering what the denominator of that number is. The last thing that I want you to think about when we talk about this is what happens when you go see your doctor. Now, as a man in his early 50s, I don't go see my doctor a lot unless there's something wrong with me. Um, when I do, he doesn't just give me a single health metric. He doesn't say, well, Paul, you know what? This year you scored an 81 on your health. That's awesome. Keep up the good work. He's going to give me several metrics. He's going to look at how much I weigh. He's going to look at my lean body mass. He's going to look at my blood sugar, my A1C, and my PSA, and all these other measurement points, and try to give me a broad picture of my health. But he can't and shouldn't, and I wouldn't accept him taking those numbers and putting them in a blender and saying, okay, Paul, your health score this year is an 82, right? Because that's not a useful metric. So what I want you to think of when you think about these scores is they are one factor that you need to consider in planning for your security improvements. They're really convenient, they're easy to communicate, they're easy to use, but you have to go a little more broadly than just looking and going, number go up, number go down. Okay, this is not the stock market. Okay, with all that preliminary stuff out of the way, let's get to what you came for. Starting with a quick tour of the Secure Score functionality that Microsoft has incorporated. The Secure Score has bounced around a couple of times in M365. It's currently part of the Defender portal, and you can get to it from security.microsoft.com /Secure Score. The idea behind Secure Score is really simple. Microsoft will define things that you can do to make your security better based on their own very deep knowledge of the platform. And not just of the platform, right? This is one thing that I think is really cool. Microsoft has been very successful in getting both horizontal and vertical integration of security. Now, it sounds weird when I say it that way, like it's, some kind of supply chain thing. But when you think about it, Microsoft has this huge wealth of security intelligence they get from running the consumer services. They have a huge wealth of security telemetry from Azure Active Directory, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, all of the Azure Compute estate. And coupled to that, they have their own security research center. They have their own threat intelligence center. They have, I don't even know how many customers worldwide who lean on them for security advice. Every government in the world, every large company in the world, they all know that they can get Microsoft to help them with threat hunting, threat remediation. So there's this huge flow of information into Microsoft that the security teams, both the parts that you see and the parts that sort of are below the wing that you don't normally see, are using to drive what these improvement actions measure. And that's really important because, as I said before, they're going to continue to evolve. as the threat landscape evolves, as the capability of Microsoft's own products evolve, as attackers get smarter and try different attacks, these are all things that are going to drive what the set of improvement actions look like. Now, I've used that term a few times. I want to stop and talk about what an improvement action is, right? That's just a thing that you can do to make your score get better. Now, it sounds a little weird to say it that way, but when you look at what actions are and what they sort of have in them, every action in Secure Score has got several things associated with it. The first, and the one most of the time people think about first, is that it's got some points. Now, what's going to be interesting in a minute when I get to the demo is that some of these actions have relatively small numbers of points, but there are a lot of them. And as I said, Microsoft is continually adding new ones. So you might look at an action and say, oh, that's only 9 points. I don't know if I want to bother with that. But 9 points might be 7 or 8% of your total possible score. So you could think of it like going back to high school and, would you be willing to study a little harder if it would give you an extra 8% on your math exam? Yeah, you probably would. The impact rating is what Microsoft uses kind of to tell you more about how important something is. Then the history, the status, and the group. Let's talk about those a little bit in more depth. So Secure Score action groups tell you what the setting has to do with. And this is important because they are broken up according to, if I say licenses, that's not quite right. Let's say platform capabilities. And this is actually a really useful distinction to make because when you think about Secure Score identity actions, those are normally things that are going to be managed by the people who manage your identity infrastructure. That may not be the same people as the ones who manage the rest of your Microsoft 365 estate. Same thing with devices, right? Those device scores are going to come from data that Defender, and in particular, Defender for Endpoint, have about the devices in your tenant or your estate. And that's probably not the same team as the people who manage your identities or the people who manage your cloud applications. So purposeful decision to put these actions into swim lanes, because then you can have multiple teams who are working on the actions that belong to or are associated with the things that they work on. I mentioned points already. Okay, obviously, the more points something has to it, in theory, the more important it is. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that Microsoft can change these weights arbitrarily. So, if you see turning off basic auth suddenly shoot up to have 1 million points associated with it, you'll know Greg heard what I said. The impact is a derived measure that says, okay, based on the number of points and also based on the number of points you could potentially earn in your tenant, which in turn is based on a bunch of factors like what licenses you have. Microsoft is not going to unfairly penalize you and say, well, if you only bought this additional license that you don't have, you could get a bunch more points because it's not fair to calculate, improvement actions for things that you can't actually do. So the impact is going to tell you, okay, of the points that are available here, what total change percentage would that drive in your score if you got all those points? Now the history, this is maybe one of my favorite features of improvement actions because it gives you a transcript of what happened and how that setting has evolved over time. And that's important because one of the things that you have the ability to do for every action is to go in and set a status. Now the status, you think of it as being binary. Either you did the improvement action or you didn't. But there's some other statuses that you need to know about that you're going to see in a minute. So if I take a look at what the details of an action look like, you can see for this particular action, I have achieved a whopping almost 0.7 points out of a total of 9 because I have 1 out of 13 users that isn't registered to be able to use MFA. Okay, this is categorized as being to address. In other words, by default, when an improvement action hits, it's going to be marked as to address because Microsoft's plan and their belief is that you're going to go through and look at every item that's marked to address, and you're going to figure out how to disposition it. Either you're going to fix it, you're going to say, well, I can't fix it, and I accept the risk, or I'm not going to fix it in 365 because it's already fixed in some other part of my ecosystem. We'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later. So for this particular improvement action, everything that I need to see about the action, except for its history, is visible in this one page. The description tells me what it is, Implementation status tells me where I am with it. The user impact, and this is interesting, the user impact tells me if this is going to result in any change that my users will see. Okay, and that's super important because sometimes the temptation that theoretically some people may suffer is, hey, man, this is great. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to jam my score up. I'm going to get that scored needle all the way over to the right. But the problem is with doing that, that if you just go and start flipping security switches to turn features on, you can cause a lot of turmoil for users because things may change in ways that they don't expect and can't predict. So I mentioned before that status is a multi-valued choice. It's not just done or not done. But because there may be portions of the improvement actions that you um, can't satisfy because you don't have the right licenses, or perhaps because your environment doesn't support it, or perhaps because uh, Microsoft is scoring a capability that you get through a third party, right? You still need a way to tell the scoring engine and tell the system, okay, you don't need to worry about this. So you can see this screenshot that I took over here on the right shows to address as a default, but these other categories also let you signal to the system what you are doing or what you've done. So planned means, yes, I'm going to work on it. This is super useful because when you sort by status, you can see the planned items will float together. And that gives you essentially a honeydew list of things that you need to work on. Risk accepted is interesting because what you're doing is then you are signaling the system, hey, I understand that this is potentially a security risk, but for whatever reason, I don't think that risk applies to me or I'm not worried about it. Okay, now when you think about what risk means in a security context, it's the potential that somebody will be able to successfully exploit some kind of vulnerability and cause damage. Those are kind of the three pillars that we think of with risk. And when it comes to getting rid of a risk, you can resolve it or mitigate it, you can reduce it, or you can transfer it. And so Microsoft doesn't use these words exactly in the actions component, but that's basically what we're talking about doing. So when you accept the risk, you say, yes, I understand that this could happen. I am very, very aware that as someone who flies small general aviation aircraft, there are a whole bunch of bad things that could potentially happen to me that are direct risks that come about because I choose to fly myself, in a 54-year-old airplane. Uh, some of those risks I accept. Some of them I mitigate. For example, my airplane has two engines, so I am mitigating the risk that a single engine failure will cause me to turn into a surprise glider, right? I mitigate the risk of flying into bad weather by having an onboard data link that gives me, radar imagery from the ground. Um, I transfer some of that risk by doing various other things, and then, in some cases, at the end of the day, I just have to accept that risk. So you're going to have to make the decision for each one of the improvement actions that you look at, what the right status is for your organization. In an ideal world, you'd go through and you would fix every control. You'd be able to check off, yep, I turned on MFA, I turned off basic authentication, I did this, I did this, I did this, and the status for all these items would turn to completed. And what's interesting is you generally cannot set the completed status yourself. Okay. The system is going to detect, did you do the thing that this improvement action calls for? And it'll mark it as completed. These other statuses are for you to use if for whatever reason you haven't completed it yet. And of course, when you change the status, this may result in a downstream change to your score. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, you'll see in a minute when I show you an example of a couple of history entries. But if you say that you resolved the risk, it seems like it would be fair for the system to give you some amount of credit for solving the problem, even if you didn't do it by taking the action that Microsoft recommended. Now, this implementation pivot is money in the bank because I know if you're like me, when you look at your list of secure score improvement actions, you're going to see some that you're not familiar with. You're going to look at it and say, well, I don't know what that is. Or more likely, hey, that's a feature that we haven't turned on yet or that we're not using, and I don't really know what the implications are if I enable it, or I don't know how to do it. So you can see from this implementation pivot, it very clearly tells me there's a prerequisite, which, okay, I have Azure Active Directory deployed. We have next steps, and we have where to learn more. This is so important. I can't overemphasize it because this is what gives you everything that you need to build a plan for improving this particular secure score improvement action. So I ought to be able to parachute you into any individual improvement action, and you should be able to say, oh, cool, I'm going to go look at the action details. Go to the implementation tab, and it's going to say, oh, prerequisite, you have to have this license. Okay, cool, I've got that. The next steps, first you go here and you do this thing, and then you go here and do this thing. And you'll see in a minute, some of the time you'll actually have a button that links you directly to the place where you can make that change in the portal. So let me stop my presentation real quick and let's pivot over and take a look at what this looks like in the real world. I will try really hard to share the correct window, but I'm not making any promises. Okay, so what you're seeing is you're seeing the secure score page or portal for the hero tenant that Microsoft gives MVPs. So it's got 25 E3 users. And I have a couple of mailboxes that I use for various things, but it's not heavily used. So I want to start by saying, physician heal thyself. I understand this tenant, really should have a more impressive secure score for me to do a good demo, but what can I say? It's kind of a sandbox. So my overall secure score is 45.03%. That 0.03, really important. I like the precision that implies. You can see how it's changed over time. You can see how my points are broken down according to category. And then you can kind of ignore this whole your secure score column. Okay, because the more interesting part are the other cards or sections here that show me here are things that Microsoft recommends as the top actions that I should consider taking. Okay, that's money in the bank. Again, right there, that's telling me here are Microsoft's best bets for things I can do to improve my security. So the top score impact is creating safe links policies. It has an impact of 5.73%, and its status is to address. Okay, this is exactly in line with what I told you earlier, that if I sort by score impact, if I sort by status, oops, I forgot I can't do that here. I have to actually go to the list of actions itself. These top two items are presumably going to have the biggest impact on my score. So if I were to enable this, that would take me from 45.03% to what, 50.8 or 50.76, which is not too shabby. Then I have some other summaries over here. Again, dashboard, it's meant to be a summary. Now let's go take a look at the recommended actions page and get a little more detail on the actions that I could take. So again, Microsoft has got these ranked. I can export them into a CSV file, which is so useful. If I do that, now I have something that I can import into a task management tool. I have something that I can turn into a dashboard of some kind in Excel that I use. There's all kinds of neat things that I can do to take this data and put it into a format that people can use without having to go to this portal because they're not administrators. Now here, I actually can support sorting and filtering. So if I block users who are over their message limit, that's going to get me a grand total of 1 point. So do I want to work on that first? Nah, probably not. So this is interesting. The biggest score impact is one where I have an alternate mitigation listed. So let's dig into that a little bit. Okay, in general, what I want is for all of my admin roles to have a strong password and IP blocking so that only the service account will only be able to connect from specified IP ranges. So if I go look at the history, you can see, okay, I marked it as an alternate mitigation. Well, in this case, this particular service account is using certificate-based authentication. I consider that to be good enough for the purposes of awarding myself some points. So I went ahead and marked it as an alternate mitigation. But this next item, creating safe links policies, let's take a look at what that's about. So right now, I have 100% of my users are not affected by the existing default safe links policy. So if I go to implementation, it shows a prerequisite. Okay, look, I've already got Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. So I have all the prerequisites I need to do this. So what this is telling me, the next steps are set an action and apply safe links. And if I go to this, if I mash this manage button, then it's going to take me directly to the place in the Defender portal where I would need to go to modify that policy. Now, what I would love to do is show you that I can go click, click, click and modify the policy and have it immediately reflect my score. But score changes can take up to 24 hours before they take effect. So I'm not going to get the instant gratification of making this change right now. But at least I can come here and I can say that this is planned. Now, this doesn't look very sophisticated, right? It doesn't seem fancy that I can go through here and look at these individual items. But it is, because I have all the range of different things that I can work on here. And I can choose which ones of them make the most sense for me at a given point in time, given what my security focus is, given what my operational maturity is. For example, let's say that I've got somebody who is a really expert Azure AD administrator. I might go to her and I might say, hey, I want you to go do the best job you can of securing our Azure AD against all threats that you can imagine, and let her go off and do her thing, and then watch my score come up. Right? I might not have to plan or research that as much if I already have operational expertise in my organization. Now, I mentioned earlier that the history view was useful because what this is giving me is this gives me a transcript of the changes I've made. And you can show in this resulting points category, you can show what's happened as a result. So, ooh, this looks bad. Okay, wait a minute. I had a regression here of 0.13 points. Well, why is that? Okay, well, I used to have 12 out of 13 users that weren't registered with MFA, which is why I had such a pitiful point total. Again, this button, Manage in Microsoft Azure, is going to take me directly over to do something about this particular item. So you can see from poking around this portal, in 5 minutes, I can get a really good idea of what my overall security posture looks like. 45%, okay, it's better than it was when it was 20%. But it's been trending up very slowly because I haven't spent any time working on it because I've been working on my conference presentations for the rest of the calendar year. But if I go take a look at the recommended actions and sort them by impact, I can cherry pick a few things that are going to have a significant impact on my score pretty quickly. So that's the whirlwind tour of Secure Score. Now let's talk about compliance score, which is similar in a lot of ways, but which is not the same. This is part of what makes this fun. Okay, quick tour of compliance score. Now, the number one question that I get when I talk to people about compliance is, well, compliance with what? If I say that you're healthy, that sort of gives a connotation. Everybody has their own understanding, and most of us have a pretty good common understanding of what it means to be healthy or unhealthy, right? If I say you're compliant, well, what does that mean? Does that mean you do whatever random people tell you? Hopefully not. In this case, we want to interpret compliance as measuring how well you're complying with some controls that are associated with something specific that you want to do or are required to do. You are HIPAA compliant. I know all of you have probably heard that phrase a billion times during this pandemic era. You're compliant with GDPR. You're compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley. You're PCI compliant, right? Some of you are probably either nodding or wincing as you think about all the times that you've heard that you have to comply with a particular regulatory regime. It's really important that you start thinking about compliance score with that in mind. For those of you that have taken physics classes in the distant past, one way to think about it is that your secure score is a scalar, like your speed, right? If I say I'm going 55 miles an hour, that tells you how fast I'm going, but it doesn't tell you the direction. It's not the same as velocity because velocity is a vector. It's a speed and a direction. So your compliance score, the way that I like to pitch it at first is it's a measurement of how compliant you are with a particular set of controls. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Okay, the way that secure score does. Your secure score is what it is. Your compliance score is what it is when measured against a particular set of requirements or a particular set of controls. So there are a couple of words that we have to have a shared understanding of to talk about compliance score that are different than what we talk about for secure score. The first is an assessment. So you can think of an assessment, and I'm freelancing a little bit, and Gary, my subject matter expert, may have to step into the chat and correct me. But the assessment is, you can think of it like a checklist, right? The assessment is a standard that you are being evaluated against. It's a group of controls, group of improvement actions. It's some regulatory body somewhere, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the I forget what they're called, the Council on Medicare Implementation, or the people who own HIPAA, the European Union. Somebody has defined the standard that you are trying to comply with, and the assessment is a measurement of, do you meet that standard? Okay, and then the template is the implementation of the assessment. And right now, Purview Compliance Manager has got more than 700 of them. So some of these are for regulations that you will recognize. Others of them are regulations that are very technical and related to a particular vertical or a particular geography. And some of them are sort of just general good practices. So improvement actions work the same way here, but the improvement actions that you see are going to be defined by the assessments and templates that you're choosing to be evaluated against. Okay, again, secure score kind of floats off by itself, or another way to put it, secure score permeates everything everywhere. But if I take one pharmaceutical company that has 5,000 users and one bank that has 5,000 users, they may see very different experiences in the compliance score tool set because they're being evaluated against different standards. Some of those standards will be, or some of those controls will be common, but others of them may be very different because a Swiss bank and an American pharmaceutical company are going to be, divergent in a lot of ways. So what happens if you don't do anything? I always like to talk about this question in the context of the service. If I just put my faith in Microsoft and say, I trust you guys, and I don't have any particular controls in mind, what do I get? Well, the default compliance score evaluations are going to tie you to Microsoft's default data protection baseline controls. Now, it sounds good, right? Data protection, we love that. Having Microsoft provided default is really good because it means that if you don't know how, or don't want to, or don't think it's important, you're still going to have the ability to improve your compliance against how do I want to put this? Against a known thing. Okay. I want you to think for a second the way that people judge dogs at a dog show. If you think about the judges, they all have a set of criteria that they use to tell, is this a good beagle? Does it look like the ideal standard of what a beagle should look like? Right? What color is the tip of the beagle's tail? And how long is the beagle's nose? And so on. Does a beagle listen? Right? If the dog is listening to commands, it's probably not a very good beagle because they just don't do that. So Microsoft is giving us all a freebie. And if I flip back a couple of slides, you'll see here on the right, Microsoft managed points. Without me doing anything, Microsoft has already given me 11,885 points out of the possible 12,000 total, just by applying the controls that they already apply for things like, do our data centers have physical security? Well, yes, of course they do. Do we apply personnel controls and background checks on the people who are trusted with information access? Sure. My own score is 232 out of 11,000, which is pretty terrible, right? That's not a compliance posture that I would want any regulator to look at and go, man, these guys don't know what they're doing. But I'm already getting quite a boost to just over 50% because of the work that Microsoft has put in, making sure that they comply with their own baseline. Now, when you get into the compliance score tool set, you're going to see that it looks a little differently. It's organized differently, but also it has some additional material that Secure Score doesn't have. For example, the Standards and Regulations tab, the Documents tab. The idea behind the idea behind this, and if you search compliance paint by numbers, there's a guy in Microsoft's Health and Life Sciences division that's done a really, really good series of blog articles that talk about the exact process of, okay, somebody came to you and said you have to comply with these regulations. What do you do now? How do you go from not knowing what to do to having a fully instrumented or fully set up compliance score environment where you are aware of the controls that apply. You're able to document which controls you comply with and how, because that's the other really important part of compliance that we haven't talked about and are not going to talk about. It's not enough for you just to comply with the regulation. You have to be able to prove to the regulator that you are compliant. And compliance score does quite a bit to help out with that. So when you look at this summary page, you can see, okay, this particular control, it's not implemented. In fact, it's not going to get any updates because I don't have the license that would be required to apply it. It hasn't been tested. It's managed by my organization. This is really important because if it's managed by Microsoft, that takes a load off, right? I can trust the engineers and the developers and the people at Microsoft to make sure that I get the right number of points. But if it's a control that I have to I apply for and then document compliance with, I have a lot more work to do. So let's pop over to what the portal looks like and take a very quick spin through compliance score and explore some of the differences between compliance and secure score. Okay, so right off the bat, notice I get this nice, tasteful ad telling me that I can get some free premium templates. Well, this is really important because Lord knows if I'm a compliance professional, I don't want to create my own template to assess compliance if I don't have to. Right? This is the entire reason that the third-party auditing industry exists, is because you can't trust random Microsoft admin to come up with a correct set of measurements to tell whether an organization is compliant. So you could explore that. Man, we could have an entire 2-day virtual airlift event just talking about all the stuff in Purview. Right. Well, I'm going to try to resist the temptation to rabbit hole any of these things and stick to what we're actually talking about. So in this case, let's go look at assessments. So notice the baseline that's applied here is the data protection baseline for Microsoft. I have 9 of a possible 828 items that I've complied with, but Microsoft's complied with 685 of the ones that belong to them. Okay, well, that's great. If I were in that business, I would come over here and I'd find a template and say, okay, I'm going to pick a template that I'm entitled to use by the licenses that I have. And that might be, oh, I don't know, FedRAMP for Dynamics or SOC 2 for Azure, right? I'm not going to dig into what all these templates mean and what my options are there. I just want to point out I can go pick a template that defines the requirements that I'm going to be measured against. And then when I do that, after giving CAMP, the compliance manager processor, giving it a chance to catch up, then I'm going to start to see my results here reflect how compliant I currently am with the assessment that I've chosen. Now, because I didn't do that, I'm only measuring against the Microsoft Data Protection baseline. You'll notice that there are a few things that are categorized differently here than they are in Secure Score. One is that the solutions are grouped differently. So whereas I had identity, devices, and apps for Secure Score, here I've got audit, Azure, Azure AD, and so on, right? I also have my compliance score broken down into categories where I might say, ooh, privacy management is super important because I am based in the EU and I have a bunch of privacy regulations to comply with. Access control, that's going to be important for everybody. Threat protection, internal risks. You're going to have to decide based on what you do or what your business does, where to focus your attention here. But I can do the same thing that I could do with Secure Score and just pop in to improvement actions and start blasting. Okay, so if I sort by points achieved, notice we don't really have an impact score or an impact rating the same way that we do in Secure Score. So I can come here and say, okay, right now, enabling MFA, I've only gotten 2 points out of a possible 27. Well, that's kind of a big deal. I probably ought to do something about that. Govern policies and procedures. Well, that's 9 points. That's not nothing. So let's see what that's about. So when I go look at this, implementation status is you don't seem to have done anything. Microsoft recommends that you assign somebody to be in charge of all this compliance business. Okay, so just for the sake of argument, let's say that I have done that and I want to mark it as done. Okay, well, how am I going to test that it's been done? I need to record that because, again, the point is not just for me to jump into improvement actions and start going, oh, yeah, done, done, done. I have to be able to prove that I did it. So I need to be able to go into this improvement action and say, okay, I have a bunch of potential controls that I can look at to tell me things that might be related to governing my policies and procedures. And then my favorite button, that'd be worth a whole seminar on its own, is that I can add some kind of evidence that proves that I did this thing. Okay, and then once I've done all this, once I've actually completed that, then I can mark the item as complete and start to watch my points trend upwards over that 24-hour window that I talked about. Some of these things are going to be really obvious. Like when I look at block outdated ActiveX controls, man, ActiveX, Lord, that's old, right? I would hope that everybody would already have done this as part of their ordinary security hardening. Okay, safe DLL search mode. Some of these things, when you look at them, they're going to be very familiar to those of you who have worked with Defender and have used Defender features to harden your environment. But there are going to be others of them that you'll look at and go, well, okay, I don't really know about that. But instead, I'm going to try to pick something where I do have some competency. So let's say, again, I'm going to go back to my example of having a really wizard Azure Active Directory admin that I can have help me with this stuff. So I'm going to sit down with her and we're going to look at this and go, okay, man, look at all this Azure Active Directory stuff that I could fix. Use boundary protection devices for unclassified non-national security systems. I don't even know what the hell that means because I'm not a compliance person. It probably doesn't apply to me, but I'm going to have to find out, which means I can go look at the documentation that's associated with this item and decide what to do. Control your tenant key. Well, that doesn't apply if I'm not using a Purview customer key, but use an identity protection solution, manage privileged accounts. These are all things that are going to have some immediate bearing, right? That I'm going to want to get in place and make sure that I'm taking advantage of. So in summary, if I were going to say, what's the difference between these two? Compliance score is taking these improvement actions for specific reasons that show that you meet some kind of external security requirement. Whereas secure score is improving things to make them better because you want them to be better. That's a little reductive, right? That's a very oversimplified view, but I don't think it's incorrect despite that. Okay, so you want to make your score better, right? That's kind of why we're here. So how do you go about doing that? Well, the easy part. Okay, we all want there to be an easy button, and it would be great if Microsoft had a portal somewhere with a big red button that said harden my environment. And you just click it and you walk down to the cafeteria and get a cup of coffee and you come back and everything would be done. But let's start with the motherhood and apple pie argument, right? The things you should be doing anyway. You should already be eating your vegetables. You should already be flossing your teeth. You ought to go through and make sure that you're getting credit for things that you know you should be doing or have done. So do you have MFA turned on your administrator accounts? If not, for the love of all that is holy, please go do that. Right? It's shameful every year when people from the identity management group have to get up at industry conferences and talk about what low percentage of people have MFA turned on for all their user accounts, much less their privileged accounts. Do you have reasonable anti-spam, anti-malware policies in place? Are you using the things that you have licensed and the things that are built into the platform? It's super easy. You don't need a lot of hand holding. Microsoft tells you right in the improvement actions list what you can do, what you should do. Go do those things. Watch your score go up. It's awesome. Next, for the things where you've done sort of them, like I sort of cleaned up my office for this presentation so it wouldn't look too terrible on camera. There are going to be gaps where, for example, you may have an admin level account that's a service account that does not have MFA enabled, because if you enable it, it will break the application that uses that service account. So what could you do there? Well, you could change the authentication method to use a certificate instead. You could find an application that works with MFA, or you could mark that risk as accepted or mitigated by a third party. The point is, don't leave items as to address or planned. Go through, and if you know you're not going to do it, mark it as I'm not going to do it, or it's being handled by some other route. Okay. The next thing to do is just sort of clean up. Go through and look, because here's the thing. In general, the status that you see in Secure Score doesn't lie. So if you think you have turned on MFA for all users and you go look at your Secure Score dashboard and it says, you have 50 users who don't have MFA turned on, I would find that believable, and I would go find out why those 50 users don't have MFA. Maybe there's a group exclusion. Maybe those users were added. Maybe they turned MFA off. I don't know, but I'm going to want to go find out. 3 super easy things you can do. You don't need permission. You don't need any help. You're a global administrator or a security administrator. Just jump in there and start doing it. But the more difficult part is, at first you have to resist the temptation to just chase points. And I realize I may have given you that temptation by showing you how to sort by impact. So you go, hey, if I do this thing, that's going to make my score go up the most. And a high score is better than a low score. And watching this score go up shows my boss that I know what I'm doing and I'm doing something positive. Okay, well, that's all true, but don't chase the points. Instead, realize that these numbers are chasing what Microsoft thinks is most important, and that may be different for you. For example, I work with a team in Ukraine. The threat model that they face is very different than the threat model that an American company will face. So the things that are most important for them to mitigate may not be the same as what a similar or identical American company would think is most important, right? And it may not match Microsoft's recommendations. So you have to take the secure score and compliance score recommendations about what Microsoft thinks is important and put them in your own head and think, okay, does this make sense? Is this really the most important thing that I could do? These tools are a guideline to help you do the next right thing. And they're not gospel. They didn't come down with Moses on a stone tablet. They're a guideline for you to use to pick out what's important.
Hey,
Then,
Paul, real quick,
yes.
your PowerPoint is not full screen, and the audience sure would like to see your content.
Oh, that is terrible. Okay, thank you for letting me know. I obviously fumbled that. This is why I was on Twitter earlier telling people to always use PowerPoint Live, because it eliminates this kind of mistake. Okay, how's that?
Looks great. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Luckily, the recording will be available so you can play it back later and zoom in if you weren't able to read the preceding slide. Specifically for Purview Compliance Manager. Okay, here's the thing. If your goal is to comply with a particular set of regulations, somebody is going to have to tell you what those regulations are. So that's sort of step 0. I'm going to take it on faith. You probably already have a chief compliance officer or a legal team or somebody who's already told you that you have to be compliant with regulation X. So start with finding the actions that you know you already are compliant with. Notice what the second bullet says. Implement, test, and attach evidence. Okay, here's the thing. For Secure Score, it's good enough to satisfy Microsoft that you did something by turning it on in the system. It's not good enough for compliance. You have to be able to prove that you did it. You test, verify, document, and attach the evidence. Okay, that way you have an audit trail, if you will. It says, yes, we are compliant with this particular feature of the regulation, and we can prove it. Next, once you've documented everything that you're already doing, prioritize the improvement actions that are most important to you across multiple assessments. Okay, and Gary made a really important point when he was reviewing this deck. You probably will have multiple assessments that are happening at the same time. Because if you are the kind of company that has one compliance regime you have to follow, you probably have more than one. Okay, if you're a publicly traded company, you're going to have a whole bunch. If you have operations in more than one country, you're going to have a whole bunch. So if you imagine that you are a publicly traded life sciences company who does business in more than one country, now you're going to have, I don't know, 10 or 20 or God only knows how many. And so you're going to be looking for the improvement actions that will give you the most impact across all the assessments that you're liable for. And that I wish I could say that that was a science and that could be automated, but it's going to depend on your judgment and your sort of investigative skill to do a good job of that. You're going to have to figure out where the biggest impact for your investment of time and improvement is going to, going to come. And then once you've done those two things, once you've documented and provided evidence for everything you did do, and then second, pick the most valuable, most impactful items. The next thing you want to do is go through and work through all of the pending actions. Okay, based on the ones that you failed that are higher, medium risk, then the ones that are failed, low risk, and then finally, the last thing you do are the ones that are not assessed, because these are just your sort of general good housekeeping items. Okay, if they're not assessed, there is a school of compliance philosophy that says if it's not being assessed, it's not important and you don't need to do it. Okay, I don't personally think that's true. Microsoft put these improvement actions into the scoring systems for a reason. That's because all of them have some value. But obviously, you want to focus on the things that will jeopardize your compliance rating the most. So the goal you should be shooting for is whatever set of assessments that you're being tested against, you want to try to get to 100%. It's a big goal. It's not going to happen overnight. The bigger you are, the more complicated it will be. Um, but the tool exists to help give you that guidance, that North Star to aim toward. But always remember, when you're talking about a compliance score of 100%, you have to ask, compliance of 100% with what exactly? Okay, and with that, I'm going to open for questions. I almost finished on time-ish. Gary, while we're waiting for questions, you want to jump in and add any color to talking about the compliance score mechanisms and tool set?
Hey, this is Joni Ryan. I'll jump in for a second and talk just very briefly about where we want to go with Secure Score.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, so I'm a PM on the Defender for 365 team, and I'm the advocate for Secure Score. And just to share, right now it's primarily a series of recommendations. And while those metrics are extremely important, what we're starting to do is really just view Secure Score as one feature of what we in the industry call enterprise posture management. So what we want to eventually evolve into is tying those recommendations into real business intent slash security initiatives. So for example, the recommendations are very valuable and required. Organizations oftentimes care a little bit more about understanding their positioning related to scenarios and initiatives. For example, instead of coming in and seeing a whole bunch of recommendations, wouldn't it be great if you could also say, how protected am I against ransomware? Or where does my organization stand with regards to zero trust initiatives? What's my risk of business email compromise? And each one of those would have, the recommendations that you're familiar with aligned with them, but we want to shift it to more of how an organization works, and how both the CISO and the risk team and the SecOps team, how they need to evaluate themselves against the recommendations. So really, how do we kind of satisfy both of those things? How does an organization report on its security posture, and then how to execute against those improvements for that posture? So, in the coming quarters, next half year, 2023, you're going to start to see more things kind of shifting into that perspective, right? So kind of more aligned with business initiatives, security initiatives, but not taking away the recommendations, and that's really the bread and butter of what you need to execute on. That's all.
Good. That's really useful, Joni. Thank you.
Yep, no worries.
It's good context. All right, Cora is waving the red flag and telling me that we need to wrap up. because we are 10 minutes over. So thanks to those of you who stuck it out for the full thing. You know, if you've been to my live presentations, you know I'm famous for running long, so I'm glad to have held up to my standard. And I'd like to thank you all for coming, and hope to see some of you in the sessions tomorrow.